Well, one of the essential parts of our constitutional structure that made that possible was unintentional in the sense that it was not necessarily intended to give the South power, and that's the clause in the Constitution that guarantees to every state 2 United States senators. Now, when that was adopted in 1789, it was to protect the small states and not necessarily the slave states. In fact, I think many people living in states like Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina, assumed that they would grow as fast or faster than the northern states. It didn't turn out that way. So that the clause guaranteeing every state 2 senators meant that as long as there were as many slave states as there were free states, and that remained true right down to 1850. In fact, one of the big issues about the admission of California was that would tip the balance to the free states. There were 15 slave states and 15 free states in 1850, and the admission of California as a free state would tip that balance, and it became difficult to see where the next slave state might come from. It did become a factor in basically giving the slave states a veto in the Senate over any national legislation. But another key clause, the 3/5 clause, was in part intended to protect Southern political power. And during the course of the 19th century, down to 1860, that gave the slave states, well, it varied according to each census, but usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 more congressmen and more electoral votes than they would have had if the slaves were not counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation. I think another factor is that starting with the Virginia dynasty of presidents, Washington, and then of course Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, the slave states dominated the executive branch of the government. In fact, for 2/3 of the 72 years between 1789 and 1861, 2/3 of those years, a Southerner and a slaveholder was President of the United States. During 2/3 of those years also, the Southerner was Speaker of the House of Representatives and President pro tem of the Senate. And I think that's because of the leverage that the South had within what was first called the Jeffersonian Republican Party, and then after 1828, the Democratic Party. As long as that party controlled the national government, which it did most of the time, that party in turn was controlled by the southern states. In fact, about the only 2 presidential administrations that were dominated by the South were, for instance, you all, or most of you I think are from Massachusetts, were the 2 Adams administrations, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And some of you are probably familiar with Gary Wills's book that came out a few years ago called The Negro President, which is Thomas Jefferson. If it hadn't been for the 3/5 compromise, Adams would have won that election. Yeah, yeah. Jefferson was elected by the 3/5 compromise. Yeah, yeah. And that was not necessarily true of subsequent Southern presidents, but it began that process and is one of the examples of it. And as I suggested earlier, I think one of the reasons the Southern states seceded in 1861 is that they saw the handwriting on the wall that domination of the national government, which they had exercised through most of the previous 70 years, was now forever gone, as long as the North could elect a president like Abraham Lincoln with no Southern votes at all.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, the leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.